I'm not a crook. I've earned everything I've got.
Military-industrial complex.
A new world order.
But we are here to destroy the control over the industry of other people.
I did not trade arms for hostages.
It's been time to be a
На полный разгром гнусных захватчиков.
Myth20c podcast.
Like war, few who haven't experienced losing their job and home, let alone seeing millions of others experience the same, can fully understand the suffering and psychological horror an economic depression brings. But from 1929 to 1932, the United States experienced its worst depression in history and the world's deepest decline in industrial production, falling 46%, and unemployment that reached 25%. With few exceptions, the Great Depression was a global one, stretching on for nearly the entire 1930s, with most countries failing to escape its grasp, setting the stage for World War in the 1940s. So hello and welcome to the Myth of the 20th Century. This is episode 8. Today we're going to be talking about the Great Depression, focusing on the United States with a little bit of context from around the world. I'm Adam Smith, and I'm joined by Alex Nicholson.
Hello, everyone.
Hank Oslo.
Howdy.
Mark Brown.
Greetings.
And Nick Mason.
Yep.
So, just to give a brief summary, the Great Depression started in 1929. It actually started 2 months prior to the famous October Black Tuesday stock market crash, where the economy in the United States actually began a recession. There was declines in industrial production 2 months prior to the October crash, but that stock market crash is what everybody remembers as the real signal that things were going wrong. And then things quickly spread throughout the rest of the world. So prior to that, in the United States at least, it was known as the Roaring '20s, where things were booming. People were, finding new employment in the big city. People were experimenting with new fashions. Jazz music was taking off. Everything was going well in the 20s, and then it all came to a crashing end. And the 30s were some of the worst periods experienced in the United States ever in terms of unemployment, poverty, suicide rates, declines in birth. And then, of course, around the world, things were bad as well. And then a lot of people not just really theorize it, it really did lead to a lot of countries going into big regime changes, including fascism, communism, etc. So with that, what do you guys think caused the Great Depression? What do you guys know about it? What do you think is the most pertinent thing we should discuss?
Well, maybe we should start with the 20s themselves and explain what was going on there. Why were the Roaring '20s the Roaring '20s?
Well, in the United States, there was a kind of transition period after World War I. Remember, the United States did not experience any war on its soil, and so it had all this armaments production capacity that, in my read, was converted into civilian usage. And so all these, industries had kind of prospered by exporting to Europe, getting, buying big shells and guns and things like that. And then they wanted to turn that into a new market. And so that turned into maybe the consumer market in the United States. That's a very short summary of what maybe caused the Roaring '20s. But anybody else have a theory?
It was an inflationary period.
The Roaring '20s is sort of it's like a marketing cliche. I mean, GDP growth in the '20s was like about 3%. It was basically trend GDP growth for the U.S. And I don't know if I would call it an inflationary period. I mean, we had a high inflation in the build up to the U.S. entry into the First World War because they left the gold standard. But the U.S. was on a gold standard in the 20s, and inflation in terms of the average price of goods, it wasn't high during that period of time. I mean, it may have been somewhat variable, but it wasn't above 5% for any sustained period. So I would dispute that notion that there was inflation.
Well, how are you defining inflation as? The Austrians, for instance, are going to define inflation as an increase in the money supply, whereas the common definition you'll find in your average college textbook is going to be a general rise in prices. And so when I say inflationary boom, I'm not referring to the price index, I'm referring to the money supply.
Okay, but I mean, well, let's call, all right, so what do we want to call a broad, let's not get into semantics. Let's establish a vocabulary at the outset. So what do we want to call a broad-based increase in average prices? Do we want to call that a banana? And we can use that word for the rest of the talk, but like...
No, that's fine. We can be on the same page.
Let's just talk about like inflation as the general phenomenon. If we want to talk about monetary inflation, or asset price inflation, or wage inflation, let's use the general word for the general case.
I have some numbers on this just to clarify from Murray Rothbard. So there was a gross expansion of the money supply of 61.8% during the 20s, 7.7% average per year, roughly 4% more than the GDP growth rate. He also says that there was an increase in $28 billion of the money supply. I'm not sure exactly how he calculates that, but there was only $1.16 billion increase in the value of gold being held.
Right, so he said, what did he say the money supply increase was? Can you repeat that number for me?
61.8% during the 20s.
Okay, I mean, I'm looking at it right now from 1920 to the peak in 1928, and I'm getting 33%.
He counts it differently.
Okay, of course he does.
There's also a lot of just kind of unambiguously good stuff happening in the 20s. Like, for instance, people are no longer being slaughtered in Europe. In America, like, you're left not in the dominance position that we were after 1945, but you still have a lot of exports happening to Europe as they rebuild. You have things like refrigeration. You start to see telephones. The actual transportation infrastructure is improving. So there's a sort of a lot of hedonic, not necessarily super measurable improvements in the quality of life going on at the
Radio
time.
was invented also in the 1920s.
Airplanes start to not suck quite as much.
Yeah, they were used in the First World War, but when did civilian aircraft or air travel take off? I think it was after the Second World War. But yeah, maybe, as you put it, it didn't suck.
Yeah, they're
you
doing
saw
all
things
sorts
like airmail.
Right.
I mean, this is like sort of like from 1800 to about 1960. There's just unbelievable improvements in every aspect, and we've sort of just been improving those technologies since the 60s.
Seriously.
It's a sort of a gross overstatement, but generalization. But
no, I agree. When people talk about the technical revolution of today, who are you kidding? I mean, just look at the telephone, look at the aviation, transportation industries, automobile, genetics. I mean, just everything was just advancing in the earlier parts of the 20th century, and then things were stagnant, big time after the 70s. I mean, the personal computer and the internet were basically all that came out of that period. That was of note, in my opinion. So yeah, this was going on, and there was kind of a pro-business administration in the United States. The kind of regulations regarding minimum wages were actually repeatedly defeated. There was basically this mentality that you need to work, and we need to be pro-industry. And the presidents during the period were
the greatest American president of all time, Calvin Coolidge.
Yeah, Calvin Coolidge, 1923 to 29.
He's actually my favorite president.
Mine too.
Why is he your favorite, Nick?
Well, you first, Alex.
Well, I better not dox myself. Besides a certain personal connection, he was, he was a total libertarian and sort of a, respectable racial nationalist and just a great guy. He didn't do anything.
He's
It
a
was
racial
wonderful.
nationalist? In
I
what
think
way?
so. I mean, I've seen some of the quotes he had, and he was just sort of a reasonable, sort of not
Yeah,
a
it's
cuck.
the
He's not a cuck.
1923 Immigration
Yes.
Act, if
Oh.
that's
Yeah.
correct.
Oh, okay. Interesting.
The
I
business
wasn't
of
even-
America's business
did,
returns to normalcy. He was a stand-up dude.
He stopped the rootless cosmopolitans coming in from the Soviet Union,
Huh.
the new Soviet Union.
I'll be damned.
Yeah. Remember, he said that 9 out of 10 people, this isn't a direct quote, but it's pretty close. 9 out of 10 people that come into the White House or want something that they shouldn't have. If you just stare for 4 or 5 minutes and say nothing, they will leave.
That's great. I think that's true of human nature,
Our first autiste president.
For our first troll, I mean, that's like a perfect thing to do. Just like mess with people. Just the sycophants in Washington. God, that's good.
I mean, this was the time when the U.S. government. The great thing about the administrations immediately after the First World War is that they could have continued the massive state that we had built up for the war, but like after the Civil War, they allowed America to kind of go back to this more locally controlled, low tax sort of night watchman state, and it's almost a miracle because obviously that didn't happen after the Second World War.
Well, and Coolidge, I do have a direct quote that I would be remiss to not mention. So his inaugural address is the shortest inaugural address. It was 40 words. Conserve the fine foundations of our institutions. Do your work with the spirit of a soldier in the public service. Be loyal to the Commonwealth and to yourselves, and be brief. Above all things, be brief.
That's amazing. That's amazing. It's like Ron Paul,
He was called Silent Cow, actually.
Yeah.
That was his nickname.
His father actually swore him into office in like a tavern in Vermont because I think he was the VP, wasn't he?
Was he? Yeah, I didn't know.
Yeah,
that.
he assumed office when Harding died in office after a series of corruption scandals. That was part of the reason why he was so inactive, I think.
Was it Harding who invented the bathtub?
Nobody invented the bathtub. Taft had a huge one, though.
Well,
You're not familiar with that? H.L. Mencken made up.
Yeah, that's a Mencken troll.
Yeah,
that man was a troll.
Was
Yeah,
Taft the one who got stuck in it or died in it? Can't remember. One of them did.
Yeah, Mencken made like this whole fake encyclopedia entry about how Harding invented the bathtub, and then it kept getting like repeated for years. Like it popped up all throughout the next like 90 years. Like people would it'd creep in.
Oh wow! But before the internet, that's like something no Snopes back then. It's just so funny, like how information was transmitted. I mean, the radio is actually kind of an interesting invention, right? Because for the first time, you can actually hear your president speak anywhere. He didn't have to get on like the train and
That'll be relevant later to talk about the fireside chats and FDR doing his uber paternal, like, oh, well, America, come sit on my lap and I will tell you how good I am to you.
Teaser,
Right.
Next episode, teaser.
Perfect. Hey, I have some numbers real quick on the sort of role of the federal government in the economy. So we were saying, there was a big increase during the First World War, and then there was kind of a drop-off during Coolidge, which is somewhat uncharacteristic for these days. When you just have an increase in the government, it seems like it doesn't go away ever. But back then, it seemed to, at least as measured by the income tax rates. So the income tax in the United States was introduced in 1913 at a 1% rate for the first bracket, and the top bracket paid a whopping 7% versus today where it's, let me pull that up, about 40%. That doesn't include state, but that's just federal. And then if you look at what happened during the war when the United States entered, I think that was 1917, it jumps up to 67% at the top rate, and it's still 2%, very low for the bottom rate. So the rich are obviously being taxed pretty heavily during the wartime. And when Coolidge takes office in 23, it's come down from the top where it was at 77% in 1918 at the end of the war. It's dropping down to 58%. When he takes office, it's at 43.5%, and then he proceeds to lower it to 24%, in 1929. And then when the Great Depression begins, essentially in the 1930s, it jumps up all the way up to 79%, right before the Second World War. So obviously during the and there was a steady increase. There was a trend to increase it by the government as things started getting bad. So maybe we could discuss a little bit more on some key stats on what was going on in terms of like how to measure how bad the Depression was. But then we can also break into maybe what caused it and what the Hoover administration was doing.
If I could just throw out a quick stat to augment what you've just said, Adam.
Yeah.
So I just quickly got some numbers. The federal government expenditure in 1930, so it's kind of before the Depression really got serious, and certainly before the big efforts. It wasn't really noticeable at that point. Anyway, federal government spending was 3% of GDP. It's actually much lower than I would have thought it was. I think states were doing a lot more of the government spending in those days. But still, federal government spending today is something like maybe 20% of GDP, maybe something like that.
Yeah, 23%, I think.
Yeah, and total government spending in the United States is probably like in the 40s, low 40%, would be my guess.
Right. Yeah, correct. Okay, so we all know the Depression was bad, but why was it bad? I think it's helpful, if nobody's ever done this, to actually just watch a documentary, because you actually see the human side of things, which you never really get from just reading. When you're looking at charts, graphs, numbers, even words, they just don't convey the pain that people were experiencing. I mean, the suicide rate, which is probably the most visceral one, to quote, went up by 50% in 1929 from prior years.
And well, by 1932, apparently, I believe 17.4 in 100,000 Americans would kill themselves.
Yeah, I had 18, whereas it was 12 before, so it went up, roughly by 50%. That started dropping off. It went down to about a 25% increase from the 20s, but 29 was like the rupture event. That's, I think, when like the stockbrokers were jumping out of their windows in New York and stuff like that. And then outside of the big cities, and actually the big cities were really hard hit in areas that were dependent on manufacturing, because and it makes sense. I mean, if you lose your job and you don't have any money, or if you're just a wealthy person and you don't have a prosperous business anymore, you're going to cut spending. But where do you cut your spending? Well, you're going to cut it on frivolous things, luxury goods, and things that also have a long time horizon for a payoff. But what you won't cut is the necessities, and that actually is borne out in the statistics. And so industrial production plummeted. It dropped like 80%. Construction was like the worst hit. So nobody's going to build a skyscraper when nobody's going to rent it, right? And that just takes years of planning, and then you don't know. There's so much uncertainty. So people really cut back, and that had a knock-on effect to all the lead-in industries like steel, cement, and then obviously the construction workers themselves were out of work. And then capital goods as well, including things like cars, which is sort of like a consumer capital good, were also very hard hit. Ford actually ended up completely stopping production in 1931. And Mark, you had some stuff on Ford you can bring up in a moment. But just to get through a couple more stats, there were 10,000 banks that failed in 1932. 40% of the total.
1/3 of all U.S. banks ended up failing by 33.
Yeah.
Well, you had these massive bank runs. I mean, the listeners might remember the film It's a Wonderful Life?
Yes, classic. I don't have your money. I don't have your money.
Bingo.
Yeah, and that actually, there's some theories as to what was going on with the banking system that I think we can bring up as to what were the causes of all this. But sorry, go ahead, Alex. You were going to say?
There were we could talk. Maybe we can talk. We'll wait and talk about banking after. But there were very creative ways of because there were banking runs in 1929 following the stock market collapse. But there were some very creative ways that bankers were able to sort of fool people into not pulling their money out and averting a disaster.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, 13 million Americans lost their jobs since 1929. The official unemployment rate.
Peak to trough. I'll just throw this out there. Peak to trough. Industrial production collapsed by 50%. Employment collapsed by 23% from the peak in 28.9 to the bottom of 33.
To contrast that, and this is from Murray Rothbard. I don't have the exact number, but from memory, the sort of, I think he called them like the consumables industry, which included things like electricity and stuff that basically is just, once you make it, like you have to use it. So like food as well, like it'll rot. The production in those types of things, which are also more necessity oriented, only dropped by about 8%. And so just, you're not going to not eat. You still need to make food. But last thing I'll mention on kind of the devastation broad strokes was that there was the Dust Bowl occurring. And this was when you had these mass migrations, the Grapes of Wrath, John Steinbeck, all these sort of people referring to these people. And actually, in my own family, my grandmother migrated during this period. Actually, a little bit later, but it was affected where she grew up in part of the country that was agriculture. Yeah, basically, yeah. And so there was this big disaster in agriculture that was partly because of the Depression, but also just like environmental. Like there was this drought, and the fact that the economy in agriculture, at least, had sort of specialized and kind of mechanized and grown into these large kind of monocultural systems, as opposed to kind of small plots of family farms where you'd like rotate things. They all ended up doing these cash crops, and so you'd have like one type of plant on this massive field versus years before, and when there was a drought, it all died, and you didn't have the kind of small organization that you could have like tree breaks and fences and things that were just occur naturally because they're not these giant open fields that are more efficient. But when you have a drought and there's no real demand for cash crops, at least, or cotton, maybe something like that, that is not a necessity of food, you basically have these fallow fields and then a drought, and you have dust, and you just have these huge windstorms that are whipping things up, and these catastrophic looking pictures. And the California Central Valley as well was also hit, and that was at the time, I'm assuming, similar to today, where they concentrated more in produce as opposed to kind of foodstuffs like the core of like bread and corn, things that would constitute the bulk of an intake of like kind of plant calories. And so produce maybe is a little bit more discretionary, like you don't necessarily need fruit or vegetables, and that was also very hard hit, and that's where the Grapes of Wrath took place, and with that very famous photo of that woman and her, I don't know how many children, just kind of looking very gaunt and saddened, sitting on the porch of their kind of house. That's where that was taken.
Yeah, there was. You see, had a mass migration too from the Okies coming out to California.
And something to build a bit of a bridge between that and the Ford thing. At that time, it's hard to imagine today, but at that time, the native Californians who had been there maybe a generation, maybe two, some of them longer, very hostile toward these people coming in from out of state who were affected by the Dust Bowl. And this is, of course, something that was highlighted in the Grapes of Wrath. And just such a discrepancy how much times have changed that within America there's like people in California. Of course, this was a time of great scarcity. I've got mine here. Here's all these Midwesterners. Screw them. We hate them. And there's all this hatred, conflict, contempt, etc. And this was a problem. It's kind of hard to imagine today. And today, about 100 years later, less than 100 years later, a man running for president is the devil for saying that that people who come into this country illegally shouldn't be welcomed. And at that time, people coming from another state within the United States were not welcomed, and this was a thing that had major popular support and was seen as legitimate. Yeah, we can't take care of all the people in California. How are we going to support all these Midwesterners? There's not enough jobs for us.
Well, the irony is pretty rich, considering that now it's Californians who are migrating elsewhere in the country, and people who are
the useful Californians who actually have skills.
Well, them and if you go to Austin, Texas or something, that place has been taken over by the parasitic Californians.
Yes,
so true. The farming class had been hit all through the 20s actually. Because of this mechanization, agricultural commodity prices, corn and wheat, and potatoes, and whatever else people eat, meat prices, all that had been falling rapidly, becoming, really more affordable. But it also sort of precipitated people to further move off of farms, and this is one of the last great periods. The 1920s, sort of before the Depression, this is really one of the last great periods where people are being moved out of farms, and you're getting a more modern economy where, not that many people are involved in farming.
And it's important to talk about, when we say farming, this was becoming a increasingly capital-intensive and capital-involved industry. Agriculture has always had kind of a finance component. Because you can very rarely afford to actually pay cash in order to do things like buy seeds and equipment and land even. So most farmers carry debt, which is important when you start talking about the interface between the agricultural sector and the banking sector.
Yeah, the foreclosures included not just city concerns, but also these farms. People would literally lose their farm, and I don't know how that was structured. I don't have specific numbers on it, but there were certainly a lot of people that told stories about how their family had to basically just leave because the bank repossessed their farm.
And an important point, talking about, Alex mentioned earlier, the thousands of banks closing. These were not Wells Fargo and Bank of America. These were mom and pop banks, people who were in just as much jeopardy of losing their livelihoods and being out on their asses. And they probably nobody wanted to drive people off their farms. It was dog eat dog. It was really desperate. People were literally starving at this time.
Yes. These loans, I think this is maybe a good way to start segueing into some of the mechanisms behind this recession we're talking about. Mm-hmm. An important thing to keep in mind about these loans is, in sort of mainstream economics, we talk about, nominal variables. We talk about nominal rigidities. We use this word nominal. What all that means is dollar denominated. But, a loan is denominated in U.S. dollars. Okay, I mean, this seems sort of like a banal thing to point out, but when the amount of spending in the economy is falling for reasons we could get into, when the amount of money available to pay back those loans is falling, the real burden of those loans, if you will, the monthly principal payment and interest payment that you make on those loans as a share of the total amount of money in the economy goes up. The loans become more burdensome, and sort of that's one of the impetuses behind these bank failures. But how do you all want to deal with? I mean, there's these competing theories of the Great Depression. How do you want to address those? I mean, I can go whenever you like.
Well, let's address first the Keynesian, the Paul Krugman view of history.
Please go ahead.
Well, so Paul Krugman is going to talk about how there's two. Before we get into Herbert Hoover, Paul Krugman, his explanation is a Keynesian, and essentially his point would be that the Fed and the state even did not enough to stimulate aggregate demand, right? That's the Keynesian explanation. Because to a Keynesian, a depression is just a drop in aggregate demand, essentially. I mean, a severe enough one, and there you have a depression. I mean, that's the Keynesian explanation. What is your take on the Keynesian explanation, Alex?
Well, John Maynard Keynes was, I mean, frankly, a remarkable genius. He was a very complicated man, degenerate homosexual, but he was extremely intelligent, extremely thoughtful, and had a number of. I mean, he changed his mind a lot. And really, it's almost unfortunate. I'm being long-winded here, but it's almost unfortunate that his name has become attached to the ideas that Paul Krugman pushes, because I mean, he was just grasping at straws, trying to come up with some solution.
And didn't he advocate that deficit spending was only a temporary solution?
Yeah, he would have been appalled. He would have been absolutely. He died in 1946, and he would have been. And look, he was probably wrong in a lot of ways, but he totally changed the way that people think about macroeconomics. And he would have been appalled at the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s, and to today, he would not have been in favor of that sort of permanent welfare state. I mean, the man was a eugenicist, and said if you're going to have a welfare state, you have absolutely got to have some sort of offsetting policy due to the incentives of it. But I mean, in principle, there's really two different camps here. Let me back up. Paul Krugman did some serious work years and years ago, for which he won a pseudo Nobel Prize, the Sweden Riksbank.
What was his work focused on?
On trade. It was good. Apparently, I haven't read it, but apparently it was pretty good. Kind of boring trade stuff, but
yeah, it's interesting. It deals with like the mechanisms that cause currency crises.
Yeah, it's presumably it's pretty legitimate, but he is not a serious person. After he won that Nobel Prize, he became increasingly not serious, to the point where he's essentially just in favor of whatever will be good for the Democratic Party. So he'll like during the Great Recession, the last massive recession that we had, 2008, 2009 downturn. He was pretty transparently, in my view, pushing for stimulus spending, and it sort of contradicted things that he had said in the 90s and the early 2000s about sort of the impotency of government spending and the ability of the central bank to be the offset government stimulus measures by. Anyway,
well, Krugman on Krugman would be an excellent book, because the guy, yes, he contradicts himself. I mean, 10, 20 years is plenty time, but he'll do it in a couple months.
Yeah, there was a blog in my libertarian days. I kept a track of
Krugman in Wonderland. Is that what you're gonna talk about? Have you read that one?
It's just like, I don't know who puts it up. I think it's anonymous.
It was William L. Anderson, I believe, and that was a good blog. Yeah, I read that.
It was picturing like, the movie cover from Kramer versus Kramer, but Krugman versus.
Well, there was in the Herbert Spencer. There was a book like that, Spencer on Spencer, the philosopher, 19th century.
Anyway, so these Keynesians, modern Keynesians, they're sort of they're just not serious people. I mean, if we had a recession now under Trump, they would be worried about the deficit, But if we have a recession under Barry Obama, then of course, we need to increase government spending, because it will, Obama will be sure that it gets to his people and it's used to benefit the Democrats. I frankly just don't find the guy very, very serious. But basically, I see like the two sort of fundamental differences when it comes to the Great Depression. There's the monetarists, there's sort of the classical economists, which would be like Gustav Cassel and Irving Fisher, and then there's like the Austrian view. But the monetarists and the Keynesians and the classical guys are kind of all in the same camp, in that like they want to increase, as you said, aggregate demand. Basically, they want to increase what Hayek called, he was an Austrian, but what Hayek called the flow of spending. This is basically GDP. It's basically aggregate demand. It's the amount of money spent. They saw that, aggregate demand had fallen, and we needed to figure out a way to get it to rise. So Gustav Cassel said, well, we're going to get it to rise by increasing the money supply and getting prices back we'll use prices as a guide. That's something we can measure. We can see it. We'll try to reflate prices back to the 1929 level. Gustav Cassel was active in Sweden, and Sweden undertook his policies. Whereas in the U.S., we kind of did a little bit of both. We cheapened our money and we increased the money supply, but we also had large stimulus spending. So there's sort of two different ways of going.
Well, my read
going
on Hoover's approach was he had an attempt to increase the price level. I don't know if that's considered an inflationary policy, but it was to the point where they were trying to increase or stabilize worker wages. And I think it wasn't necessarily for a broader price index concept. It was more for kind of a humanitarian attempt to kind of keep the worker protected. But in doing so,
unfortunately, that put people out of work.
Yeah, no shit.
Well,
So that
brings up an important. I'm sorry to run over you, but I just want to make this point very quickly. It's very difficult to reason from a change in a price because there's a supply and a demand side to things.
Right.
So what the Keynesians and the I'll just call them the monetarists. Those are the people who want to cheapen the currency. What they want to do is they want to get prices back up through the demand side. They want to increase demand spending so that prices are bid back up. Whereas what Hoover was trying to do in the early days of the Depression was throttle basically by fiat. Just say, okay, well, we have to just don't pay people less. He was sort of just trying to mandate that prices not change without getting people to go out there and spend the money needed to bid prices up kind of in a more natural way.
Yeah,
he was trying to use the state to somehow thwart reality.
He was an engineer. He was a mining engineer and a civil engineer from Stanford, and I think he was applying kind of engineering think to a system that is a little bit more, I'm sorry to say, complex than building a bridge, even though building a bridge is a worthy endeavor. But I don't know how many orders of magnitude, but let's just say a big number, more complex. And you have to use different tools. I mean, it's not like you have a problem and then you attack that problem. It's just a different animal. And it's also, you're dealing with people, and so they're irrational. And so there's a lot of, and this is where I actually respect Keynes in particular, because he, I think, was right when he said there is something to human nature, and that he called it animal spirits, where people are risk averse, and when things are bad, they get even more risk averse. And so that actually decreases the amount of demand in the economy, and that further decreases the amount of demand in the next cycle because people see that other people are spending less, so that they can't spend money to invest. I think that makes total sense.
Yeah, I mean, it is a confidence game, and to sort of throw Hoover a bone here, this is a period. I think I was talking about this offline earlier. This is really kind of a new. The 1930s are really still a sort of a new period for Western society, advanced society, in that we're finally really moving to. We've had downturns in the past, but we're finally, the 1870 downturn was big, but we're moving to a period where almost everybody is working in a market, and we're also moving into a period where we don't have private money. Where previously money was sort of not really. It wasn't. It's sort of hard to generalize, but it wasn't regulated to the degree that it was after the Federal Reserve was put into place. And the Federal Reserve had a sort of, on paper at least, it had a certain function to prevent a bad consequence of the old private money system, namely bank runs. But they didn't quite realize how powerful the tools they had and that they were playing with. They were sort of like a child, in the control room of a big ship, pressing buttons at random. And
it was terra incognito for sure.
Yeah, people didn't know what was going on. I mean, in 1840, in rural Ohio or something, you're not that linked into the market. If there's a demand for unaccompanied demand for gold bullion or something, it's just not going to affect you that much if you have fewer customers for your what do they grow in Ohio? I don't know, corn or something. If your sales for corn fall, it's not good. You have fewer coins to go out and buy manufactured goods with, but you'll be okay. I mean, you could probably make do, just kind of bartering food products with the people in your town.
Well, and if you get hungry, you could always eat your shoes.
I think that's a very bad joke, but yes, I think that's what you're trying to, I think that's your point. Point is taken. I think the subsistence farming.
Alex is making a good point though about the ways in which this was new territory, but I think it would be beneficial if we went over, to set the scene, we went over the ways in which the system and the economy were different during the 1920s and 30s to now. One of the big things is the gold standard, as well as the Fed itself was the regional branches of the incorporated banks, had a far more autonomy than they do now. The system was less centralized, so it was a little harder for them to run this out of New York.
Yeah, and
the very nature of the Fed was the gold standard makes it so that the Fed, it's very difficult to. All the Fed could really do back then was
you could slash the discount rate was probably the main thing.
The primary mechanism that the Fed was using until midway through the Depression actually was adjusting the discount window, the rate at which the banks can get short-term loans from the Fed itself, which is kind of it's a effective mechanism if you wildly alter it. I mean, obviously, it had impacts on the money supply, but it doesn't. It sort of has different effects than the policy levers that we tend to use now, which are just kind of directly mucking around in securities markets.
And let me give you the numbers on the discount rate. So it was 6% in October of 29, and they kept slashing, and it got down to by June of 1930, it was around 2.5. Went steady for a little while, kept slashing, and it got down to 1.5, and it held steady there for 31, and then they finally hiked it in after August of 1931.
That's a really bad time to raise interest rates.
Oh, and there you go. Boom, depression. I mean, when you throw in the measures that Hoover was taking to sort of to tinker with the problems that people were having in terms of poverty and employment, we throw all that together. I mean, that hence it's a recipe, and then you get FDR later, which we'll get into next episode. But that I think is a pretty good way to look at sort of when this really kicks off.
Yeah,
that's when the nail was driven into the coffin. I mean, I think it was trending down, but that's when it really started.
1931 is known as the tragic year.
Yeah,
it was just a recession until about 31. No. It looked a lot like the 1920s.
It was a bad recession, though. I mean, I think they were dropping like 8% a year, which is pretty hard. But yeah, it didn't bottom until.
Alex, did you say 20? Because that is something that is not talked about much. There was a recession from 20 to 21.
Yeah, I mean, the U.S.
thing that people kind of directly compared with is the panic of 1907. So you had a similar pattern where you had a large number of bank failures. You did have a subsequent drop in GDP and employment, but essentially J.P. Morgan personally, in a consortium of other kind of large financial players, at that time, the banking sector was small enough that they could basically personally organize a bailout of the affected institutions and kind of prevent the contagion that you saw in the 30s.
Not only the size, and this is coming from Milton Friedman's theories, but the structure of the banking system was different. At least prior to the Fed, people like J.P. Morgan were essentially the Fed, and underneath him there were regional banking, relatively large banks, not like Morgan's bank, but larger than the local sort of savings and loan thrift that lends to the mom and pop dry goods store. And so what they would do before the Fed was essentially they'd have these kind of local clearinghouses. And so if there was a panic, a bank run, somebody made a over withdrawal, or a bunch of people showed up and they didn't have the deposits on hand, these consortiums would actually realize that that was a potential risk to all of them. And so what they would do is they would sort of have these kind of like short-term lending windows between each other. And they would mitigate the spread of the problem in that local region because they all realized they're in it together. But what happened after the Fed was introduced was that these regional consortiums were like, well, fuck, it ain't our problem. Give it to the Fed. And it kept going up and up and up to all the way to the top, where essentially the responsibility rested at that one chairman. And if he wanted to behave I forget the name of the Fed chairman during the Depression, but the Treasury Secretary was Mellon, and Mellon's sort of policy was liquidate, let the incompetence die. And if they don't do anything when it reaches that level where everything is suddenly everybody else's problem, then yeah, you're definitely going to go down. And so that was Milton Friedman's point. It was like it's the centralization of the banking system and the abrogation of responsibility. There's one central authority that made the Depression spiral to the entire country and then the entire world.
Eugene Meyer was Fed boss from September 1930 to May 10, 1933. So he's like the mostly responsible.
Was it Arthur Burns? Was the name?
Oh, Burns is way later.
Okay.
Way later. 78.
Oh, 78. Oh, okay. Yeah.
Yes, it was Burns who famously said that if the Fed doesn't do what the president wants, they could lose their independence.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Which is on its face, an absurd statement.
Yeah, right.
But let me if I could go into a bit of a digression, it's an important digression. I'd like to talk about the French role, just so we can kind of get it out of the way, if you don't mind.
Yeah, and
well,
before
after
you do that,
I'll talk about the British role.
Okay. Before you do that real quick, France is very interesting to me, and I mentioned I had some information on the international facts about the Depression. France is one of the few countries that actually did not experience very much of a depression at all. I mean, it was basically a mild recession. I think their GDP went down by like 5% or something, or unemployment was comparable as well. So what happened in France?
Yeah, there are, just before we get to France, on that note, there are a few other countries that didn't have much of a depression, and they're Spain, which had a fiat money standard. It didn't have any sort of commodity backing of its currency, and China. China has a silver standard. So it's the gold standard that's sort of the key to understanding the Great Depression. Basically, the way that it works is the central banks of these various countries, it's essentially Western countries and their colonies, they make their currency redeemable in gold coin, basically. So you can take a French franc to the bank after World War I, after they adopted the gold standard. You could take your French franc to the bank and get gold. So that sort of puts a limit on how many banknotes they can issue, and also how many bank deposits there could be, because they have to sort of hold to this gold standard. So if you're from England and you see, well, what happened was the French essentially, they rejoined the gold standard in, I think, 27. They mispriced their currency. They made it a bit cheap relative to their gold holdings. So they made their goods attractive to the export market. So someone would come over, they would trade pounds sterling for French francs, buy the goods. The bank in France has these pounds, and so they redeem them for gold, and they get gold. What they should do at that point is issue more French francs with the gold that they got. Mm-hmm. Okay, and then that increases the supply of francs, and it puts upward pressure. It should, it should create inflation in France, basically. Yeah. But instead, and then that should kind of over time even out that trade sort of advantage that they had. But what happened was that they sterilized that gold. They just kept. They wanted to maintain a sort of an attractive currency, or rather an attractive export market. So they kept the gold in vault. They didn't. They sort of ran a deflationary policy within France, and they hoarded gold.
Mm-hmm.
And so I've got a number for you here. 1927, France has 7% of world gold reserves. So this is like gold bars that get moved around between central banks. Like, it's not the total gold in the world. You know, there's all sorts of gold in like Hindu temples that's not counted here, but it's effectively monetary gold. In 1932, they have 27% of world gold reserves. So you think France, who gives a shit? But the problem is that this is...
That would imply that they're buying gold, not just hoarding it, right?
Well, they're getting gold inflows, and they're not making new French francs. Yeah, they're
right.
In effect they're buying gold with their exports. Yeah. They're basically giving away their exports for gold at like a discount relative to the price of gold. It was an insane policy.
Was it? Because they didn't have a depression. Why is it insane?
We have to look into the monetary history of France. They may have left. I don't know exactly what happened. They left the gold standard earlier, but what it does is they're soaking up the base money for the whole world.
Mm-hmm.
And the Fed ended up doing the same thing. The Fed ended up hoarding gold as well. Their gold reserves rose, but this matters because like we have at this time as in today, they have fractional reserve banking. Now, certain Austrians and internet people, cranks on the internet, get very worked up about this system, but in principle, there's no problem with it.
Well, without that, I don't know how you have a business. I mean, it's like if you literally just lend out the $1 in deposit that you received from your depositor as a loan, there's not much for you to do.
You'd have to charge. You basically do what banks are doing now when interest rates are really low, and you charge people to warehouse their money.
Yeah. Your operating costs would not cover, like the.
Well, the fractional reserve banking is in the context of what we're talking about here. Fractional reserve banking creates a serious problem with a fixed gold exchange.
Yeah, it doesn't. I mean, there's probably ways that they could have tried to make it work, but it's problematic in a growing economy because you really need to have sustained deflation, and you need to have policies that allow your population to basically work with a sustained fall in prices. Which, I mean, maybe it could happen, but there's certain reasons to think that it could be problematic. But you basically need gold supplies to grow 3% a year if you want to maintain just zero inflation. But anyway, so you have gold supplies, falling, whatever. The French soaked up 20% of the world's gold in this period, in a relatively short period. And so people think that people behave. You have your bank account, and bank accounts are very important in these days. Less important today where we have easy credit cards, but you think that people go around acting like they have $1,000 in the bank, or maybe back then it was $100 in the bank. But you really don't. It's kind of a confidence game, and I don't know. I don't know how much.
No. You have $1,000 in the bank if you go to withdraw it, assuming nobody else does. But if they all do that, there's no money for everyone there because it's all being lent out to the customers at the bank, basically. So this gets into one of the arguments ostensibly why the Fed was created. It was like, well, we need like this big clearinghouse in the middle that if there is this giant bank run, in theory we could actually backstop it. But because we're so big and amazing, nobody's even going to try, so we won't have any more bank runs. That was the original reason for the Fed. It had nothing to do with controlling inflation or unemployment like it is today. It was actually created by this, or proposed originally by this guy from the Warburg Bank, and he was a guy from Germany. Anybody can look into him further if they want, but basically that was an attempt to address what you're just pointing out, is that you actually don't, all of us don't have the amount of money that's stated on our savings
That was
account.
the nominal reason, right? So and I agree with Alex that fractional reserve banking is not. There's theoretically it's certainly no problem, but the problem is who controls the system. And the Federal Reserve was created by these bankers as an attempt to cartelize the banking system. That's the real purpose of it. And yeah, you can have a fractional reserve system that works. I don't dispute that at all. But what was happening here was the same as you see with antitrust regulation, other cartelizing measures, where they basically, give a justification that is far from the real interests of the people who created this at Jekyll Island.
Right, and the private sector had developed mechanisms like before the 29 to 33 downturn. The U.S. had, recessions frequently. I mean, I have one of these. I have the employment plot up from the Fed's online statistics website.
That's from
and
the St. Louis Federal Reserve Bank.
Yeah, the St. Louis Regional Fed has this awesome website, FRED, who's probably has some. It's an acronym, but there's all these recessions. There's a recession just before 1905. There's a recession around 1907. There's a recession in 1910. There's a recession in 19. There's a lot of recessions, but they're usually actually not that deep, and they're pretty short usually. It's because the private sector kind of worked out ways to sort it out. And the other thing is that people were aware that there were going to be big downturns, so they would carry a lot of, they would hold a lot of cash, so that they could weather these downturns. And one of the problems today is that we had such stability, really, since the Great Depression, and from a long standpoint, that we're very fragile. But maybe that's a digression we should go into. But the basic
back then
idea
you
is,
could actually hold cash. You could hold savings in cash. I mean, now with monetary inflation, I mean, this is effectively a tax on savings.
Right.
Well, yeah, I mean, we could go into that, but the point about the French thing is that they're soaking up this base money. Okay, this is like, if you will, real money. It's sort of money you could hold in your hand. It's gold, and without that monetary base to support the fractional reserve, the sort of pyramid on top of that, the money supply, sort of bank accounts, the deposits, the number of dollars that are stored in bank accounts, that are stored in commercial banks, that can't grow. There's a sort of a ceiling on how high it can grow. I mean, the Fed can lower the reserve requirement, and that's about it. That's about the extent of what can be done.
They did do that. Am I not mistaken on that? I mean, I don't know how else that could happen with the expansion of the money supply like it did.
The money supply stops growing. That's the problem.
The gold money supply stopped growing. I mean, that was Murray Rothbard's statistic. I mean, it grew, but it didn't grow proportionate to the growth and the credit, or whatever you want to call it.
The number of dollars deposited in banks, plus currency, plus gold reserves, that started to fall. It's basically the deposits in banks.
Wait, when did it fall specifically?
All right, it stops growing. All right, and keep in mind, this is a country, and yet we're back to the United States now. We're off France. This is a country where people are having 4 kids. This is a country where we have all this awesome technology being introduced. There's lots of low-hanging fruit for economic growth. The money supply, looking at the graph now, it basically is not growing from 1928 up until the recession starts in September 1929. It just isn't growing.
Okay.
It's kind of going up and down very slightly. It doesn't start to really fall until about 31.
Are you looking at M1 or M2?
I'm looking at money stock at commercial banks plus currency held by the public.
The reason. So let me your interpretation is perfectly solid with the Friedman Schwartz view. The reason there's going to be this difference with Rothbard, which is Adam's citing Rothbard's work, America's Depression, is that Rothbard is taking into account other money substitutes. I don't have the book in front of me myself, but that is why it's a controversial argument, is that he was accounting things that are not typically accounted for, but he explains why he's doing that. And the debate is over whether that's really impacting the system or not. He focuses particularly on acceptances, if I remember correctly, and acceptances, time deposits, and I wish I had Adam has a book.
Yeah, I mean, there's different ways of measuring the money supply. Certainly, I mean, the great thing about Friedman's work is that he shows that, especially in the period that he was active, I mean, M2 and these sort of equivalents, it's basically kind of, it doesn't really matter what you're looking at. You look at deposits in commercial banks plus the monetary base, and, you know, that's sort of we'll just call that the money supply. That's a good predictor of economic growth up until maybe the 60s. And then 70s, 80s, the relationship sort of starts to break down. And today it's not really a very good measure, but they didn't have nominal GDP back then. No one had even thought of it. I mean, Keynes essentially sort of came up with the idea for it, and then they started calculating it in the 50s. But it's sort of like the best thing we can look at. And, you know, you see the decline in bank deposits. When that falls, industrial production falls. When that rises, industrial production rises. When that falls, employment falls. And similarly, when we go off the gold standard and you know, the U.S. dollars deposited in bank accounts begins to rise, the economy recovers.
So can you summarize what your contention is? Are you talking about the monetary theory now, or are you talking about your theory?
I'm talking about the monetarist, sort of the conventional monetarist theory.
That's the Friedman Schwartz monetary history of the United States.
So they're arguing that the money supply is causal in which seems
Friedman
ridiculous. It seems like a correlation, but it doesn't cause the economy. But go ahead. What's this?
Friedman shows that going back to where the hell is the book? I think it's 1870. He shows that going back to 1870 and other work that he's done, he's found other historical examples from different countries. He shows that changes in the money supply precede changes in prices and changes in various measures of real economic activity. That's what he shows. That it precedes it. And if you kind of think it out, it kind of makes sense that would be the case.
You can change the price level, but I mean, it's not a physical good, so it's essentially just how's everything.
Well, if it changes the price level, and you have sticky prices, you have sticky wages, that means that people are hesitant to take pay cuts, and employers are hesitant to give pay cuts. They'd rather just fire people and keep some people on at the previous wage to avoid, you know, whatever issues with people not working as hard. And where people have debts that are denominated in U.S. dollars, not denominated in inflation-indexed U.S. dollars, then it actually matters a lot how much money is available. If the amount of money falls by 40%, there's 40% less money for people to pay their debts back, and banks fail, and then banks don't lend money, and then businesses can't get money, and people get fired, and it's this cycle that goes on until the private sector kind of bailed each other out.
Well, to quote Calvin Coolidge, when more and more people are thrown out of work, unemployment results.
Yeah.
Come on, guys. Come on.
It's like a Yogi Berra.
Yeah, very Yogi Berra.
But the notion of like the feedback loop is really important here, and the fact that this feedback loop is mediated by the banking sector. Like, if you take an actual economics course and they talk about the Great Depression, like all of the kind of modern literature focuses very heavily on that because of its sort of it's a justification partially for the way that the Fed acted in response to the 2008 crisis, where they basically did the opposite of everything that they did in the 1929 depression. But so your story of like there's a collapse in the money supply, which means that if I owe the same amount of money in nominal terms, like that increases the burden on me. So I declare bankruptcy. Everybody else declares bankruptcy. The bank fails because they can only sell these assets for, 80 cents on the dollar, which isn't enough to actually cover their debts. And now, because you have fractional reserve banking, like all of the depositors are only getting back N cents on their dollar. So like this ripples. And in the meantime, like you can't necessarily tell which institutions are actually stable. You can't tell which banks are stable. So you have like what should be just kind of a purely nominal shock gets concretized, and it actually destroys the infrastructure that you need in order to keep your economy running.
And the interest rate too is the thing with when the money supply falls, you're going to occasion a rise in interest rates, right? And the Austrian business cycle.
That's not true. I'm sorry to run over you like this, but
no, go ahead, man. Go ahead.
Milton Friedman made the observation, and you can see it today. Interest rates actually tend to fall when inflation is low and when the economy is weak. I mean, interest rates are basically the price of money. I'm sorry, they're the price of credit. The price of money is every good in the economy. So that's why you have ultra low interest rates today. You have ultra low interest rates in Japan. The economy is weak. The flow of money in the economy is low. I mean, no one wants to borrow, and that's what you had in the Depression. They can do whatever they want. They can raise interest rates in an environment where the economy is very weak, and that will kill the economy. But ultimately, you can have very low interest rates. Interest rates are actually really not a good indicator at all of much of anything.
Well, but they're going to affect higher order capital production, right? I mean, whatever those interest rates are, those are going to determine ongoing, things like construction projects are going to be very sensitive to them. And that's why if you have a quick rise, you're going to have all these projects that are no longer completable.
That's the Austrian story, yeah. I mean, it's basically saying that businesses are not very forward-looking and that they can't anticipate. They build empires that are like highly sensitive to interest rates. I mean,
well, there's also the element of cronyism too, where people sort of can expect. I mean, it's probably not as bad then, but nowadays, the big people are, they expect the state will come and help them out, bail them out.
Yeah. I mean, after Lehman Brothers, I don't know how many people. You have to be buddies with them. Probably Goldman.
Yeah. That's what I mean, though. That's what I'm talking about. The cronies. I don't mean just any. I mean people who know that they could do this. I mean, also I want to make one point of clarification though. So it wasn't actually the gold standard per se. It was what it actually was the gold exchange standard, right? And
it was a specific mechanism. Yeah, this is not like the old 19th century gold standard.
Well, because gold used to be a dollar was denominated a weight of gold, right? Mm-hmm. And that. What happened from the period of 1926 to 1931, to read from this here, the United States remained on the classical gold standard, redeeming dollars in gold. Britain and other countries of the West, however, returned to a pseudo-gold standard. Britain in 1926 and other countries around the same time. British pounds and other currencies were not payable in gold coins, but only in large-sized bars, suitable only for international transactions. This prevented the ordinary citizens of Britain and other European countries from using gold in their daily life, and thus permitted a wider degree of paper and bank inflation. But furthermore, Britain redeemed pounds not merely in gold, but also in dollars, while the other countries redeemed their currencies not in gold, but in pounds. And most of these countries were induced by Britain to return to gold at overvalued parities. The result was a pyramiding of the United States on gold, of British pounds on dollars, and of other European currencies on pounds. The gold exchange standard with the dollar and the pound as the two key currencies. So the relationship as well between the British, because what happened with England is they went off of the gold standard during World War I, right? And
all the combatants did.
Yeah, that's correct. And they returned, and I believe 1926 or 7 to gold. Let's see. But the problem that they had was that they returned at the pre-war rate. And
right, thanks to Winston Churchill.
Exactly. And what this created was a gold drain to the United States. And so what happened was the Fed, there was this deep crony Anglo Northeast relationship, and Jewish as well. And that the Fed, the New York Fed chair was induced to basically bail out Britain in this way. So agreed to inflate the U.S. monetary base for the explicit purpose of getting gold back into the vaults in London. And that was a major factor. This happened in 1927. It was a major factor in the inflation leading up to the Depression.
We're talking about the monetary base increase? Or no, I'm sorry, the money supply, like the broadly measured money supply increase. We're using the Austrian definition of inflation.
Yes.
I have a.
Look. Honestly, I think Rothbard is a kook. I think that he's making up data here. Like, if you look at these seemingly predictive measures of money, you get about a 3% yearly increase in the 1920s. I'm going to say that.
I don't disagree with you just because I can't make heads or tails of his book, to be honest with you. I have it open in front of me, and he's just so long-winded. It's one of those few times in economics where I wish there were more equations. It's just words. What is he talking about? But anyway, I have this table. It took me, 10 minutes to look through this thing to find something that resembled something that was coherent. But essentially his sort of definition of money supply is total dollar claims. And that is composed of two things. Total gold reserve. Okay, everybody can picture what that is. It's a gold bar. And then total uncovered dollars. This is where it's sort of unclear to me. And I guess that's essentially what he's calling like bank credit or deposits, or something to do with that. But again, it's like there's just gobs of words here, and I can't really pin him down on what the hell he's talking about. But anyway, that's where he sort of says... If anyone's
really interested in this, I would encourage people to read that book, regardless of what Adam and Alex think about it.
I'm just confused. I'm not concluding anything. I can't get...
Let me clarify one thing, though. Like, regardless of what one thinks of Rothbard, it's just a historical fact that this cozy relationship existed, and that the New York Fed was induced to increase the money supply at behest of England, and that was in 1927.
So what does that mean? So they were selling their gold back to London? Is that what you're saying?
Well, it depends on how you understand the cycle. Like, if you don't accept that it was the monetary inflation of the 1920s that led to the recession and then the Depression, then it may not mean as much to you. Right.
No, I'm just asking, what do you literally mean? So the inflation was, Britain is printing paper, pounds, to buy gold from the vaults.
Well, they were pyramiding,
the United States.
As I explained, the gold exchange standard, they were pyramiding off of dollars as well.
Right? I don't know what pyramiding means, though. I understand what a buy and a sell is.
They were treating dollars like gold, because you could hand a dollar into the Fed or any bank in the U.S. and get gold. They were treating paper money from the U.S. like gold.
Okay. I won't belabor this. I'll let the listeners decipher it. But let's move on. Let's move on. Go ahead. Just wrap it up.
My problem with the Austrian theory is that, firstly, it assumes that the private sector isn't forward-looking and isn't building a business that's robust to changes in the price of credit. And secondly, the Depression was coordinated around the world. And then countries recovered to the extent and coincident with the time that they took steps to boost their, the money supply and get prices to rise. Like Sweden is a great example. The Swedes actually recovered very, very smartly from the Depression by cheapening their currency and targeting the level of prices. They had a price index, and they got it back up, and they recovered smartly. The United States started to recover in 33, and then it dipped again. Well, we don't want to get too ahead of ourselves, but it dipped again later, and that coincided with a decline in bank deposits. Same story with Germany, and like I said earlier, it's the same story with, or rather, the theory is supported by China and Spain. Like, China and Spain are fine. Hell, Spain's using a fiat currency. They're using the worst thing in the world from the Austrian perspective. They're using paper money. Yet, nothing's happening.
Right.
We have so many other instances. We have, like, Australia hasn't had a recession since 1991. I mean, you'd think with all this money printing that Australia's been doing in central banking, they'd have had a recession, especially when they've had shocks to the commodity markets and so on. It just doesn't hold up with the data, in my opinion. I think that we have a simple story where the quantity of money and the amount of money that's spent I think that does the heavy lifting that we need.
I have a simple question. So the Fed was created in 1913. We can all understand what that means. Like they built a building, and okay, you're in charge of this now. And the recession of 1921 apparently went forward without a problem, but the 29 recession turned into the Great Depression. So what did the Fed do differently, given that they're in charge ostensibly in 21 compared to 29?
Well, they cut the discount rate.
Okay.
Yeah,
Okay.
honestly, if you could, I don't know if you have that deck of charts. The money supply drop in 21 is, it's really not too bad. It looks like it's about 33 billion to about 31 billion. That's the sort of the peak to trough drop, and for much of the recession, it's just sort of flat.
Well, and also the thing that we're coming into next here, we gotta discuss Hoover, and I want to get into the political side of this, because while we could debate about monetary theory and the way that business cycles work, part of what made this so problematic was the domestic political interventions that were undertaken by Herbert Hoover.
Okay, go ahead. So.
Well, do you guys want to get into Hoover now, or do Alex have anything more on?
I think we should.
I've said what I have to say. Yeah.
I think we should move forward. So what's your topic on Hoover?
Well, we could start maybe with Smoot-Hawley, or
Well, that one I think is commonly cited, but I think commonly misunderstood. My understanding is that international trade back then was less of a factor for all economies concerned, and in the United States in particular, it was not that detrimental. Now, some economists believe that it was detrimental to Europe, but it was not a major factor in causing the U.S. depression. Anyway, go ahead. That's my opinion.
Well, no, I mean, you're right that they do point to the Smoot-Hawley frequently. Where do you guys want to put the timeline? Because when did Hoover get in office? He was in
29, right at the
29.
beginning of the depression.
Right.
It's horrible timing.
Enter stage left.
Yeah.
Well, what do you guys' opinion? Let's just give a kind of thing on Hoover. Like, what do you guys know about Hoover? What do you think about Hoover? What do you have to say about Hoover? Just as
he's an engineer, and he's a well-intentioned guy who probably didn't understand enough about the banking system. But other than that, he probably would have done fine if this issue wasn't across his desk.
Well, how would you guys describe him politically?
Conservative.
I got that he was
moderate conservative.
More in the ilk of more in the mold of Roosevelt, the original Roosevelt. He was a sort of a progressive.
Yeah, was he you, Alex, who mentioned him voting for the Bull Moose Party?
Yeah.
I would like to mention one thing about Hoover, just as an aside. He wrote a book that actually only recently got published. I believe it's called Freedom Betrayed. It's sort of his memoirs, and he actually was very much against the, after the fact, at least, he came to regret the U.S. intervention in the Second World War, which I think is interesting.
Interesting. Yeah, well, he obviously had
he was an honest man on some level.
I don't know about that. He might have some bias against Roosevelt.
Yeah, but this was something that he wrote privately and was published later. It wasn't,
That doesn't mean
we just
anything.
found this out recently.
I mean, maybe he's being careful, I mean, it's wartime. Why would you come out and criticize your president? You can't do that.
Yeah, could be.
No,
but his rhetoric was far more conservative, so to speak, than his actions. That's really the key, is that, and people like Krugman want to paint, and I should also say about Krugman, you're right, Alex, that he's not a serious person. I completely agree with that. But if you take economics in college, you're going to read you're going to have a lot of textbooks that were written by Paul Krugman. So Paul Krugman is going to end up influencing some people's views of things. So regrettably so.
Oh yeah, he's hugely influential. There's no doubt about that. I think he's a bit less influential than he was maybe 5 or 10 years ago. But yeah, he's an influential guy.
His whole thing was that Herbert Hoover was, didn't spend enough money, essentially. I mean, Herbert Hoover was too much of a laissez-faire guy. That's the narrative. But, I mean, how does that square with, for instance, my chart here of federal spending by fiscal year? $3 billion in 28, 29, and rising to through 29, and continue to rising, and by 31, it's $4.5 billion.
Right. After the economy as a whole drops by 25%, something like that. I think it was more actually. I think it was like in the 30s or even 40s.
And also, I have the surplus and deficit as share of GDP.
Right.
It's about 0.5% in the positive in 28, 29, and it went up a little bit, and then by 30, it was down into the negative about 0.5 or so, and by 31, 32, it was down into negative 4%.
Yeah, the U.S. federal government in the 1930s was, prior to the Second World War, very small compared to the proportion it commands today. It was 5-10%, no more than 10%. I don't think
that number I had from 1930 said 3%.
Yeah, it was small. Yeah, exactly. So I don't know what the number is, but something like that. And today it's 23%. So
that's just federal government, too.
Exactly.
Total government spending is about 40%.
Yeah. It's like, I don't know what French levels are. I think they're above 50, but it's like approaching it.
Top is Denmark at around 60, and then France is probably 55. Germany's about 55, 50.
It's like, what's the difference between socialism and communism? It's like, I don't know, 40%. I mean, Jesus Christ.
They ostensibly have a market still, but it's just unbelievable how much governments spend today, how much they do.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, and Hoover kind of was this is the first New Deal, what Hoover did in 31. This was, and so in many ways, like the kind of stuff we see from that has become the norm. Hoover was one of the first, really.
Sure. Well, we all know the Hoover Dam, I don't think anybody really regrets that project either. So
wage and price controls, many tariffs. I created the Federal Farm Board, where they would make loans to farm cooperatives in order to keep products off market.
I think and without getting too much into FDR, I think Hoover's thing was that he wanted to stimulate the supply side, and FDR wanted to do demand, and the demand being like the consumers. His was business orientation, and so if businesses aren't going to spend what he's kind of prodding them to do, well, then he's basically like, well, the market is just doing what it wants to do. And I think where the kind of more command economy people would say is that, well, if they're not going to spend it, you need to spend it. And that's where the public works kind of like philosophy comes into play. You build a contract, you bid it out, and then they will come in and actually start working. And I don't know I guess that accounts for like probably the increase in spending, the public works. But all these sort of these kind of legal measures that were passed, to me, they seem to be more regulatory red tape more than anything else. I personally think that public works were probably a good idea, but the kind of price controls, and you need to raise your wages here but not over there, and we're going to do this, and that, it just seems really ad hoc and not really based on anything sensible.
The thing is that in this system that we're talking about here, where people are spending basically Federal Reserve notes, and they're paid in Federal Reserve notes, and they're borrowing in Federal Reserve notes, somebody is in charge of that, right? Like the Fed is in charge of that, and they're sort of so powerful that what they do outweighs anything that the government is going to be able to do. Like if the government increases spending by $4 billion, but then the Fed continues to run its contractionary policy to the tune of more than $4 billion, let's say, on the margin, then anything that the government has done has sort of been canceled out. It's like the government stimulus can only be effective if the Fed doesn't offset it. And in this period, the Fed kind of not really realizing what they're doing or thinking they're doing good. They're sort of they're the one that moves last, so to speak.
Well, regarding the public works, I did find something kind of interesting. There's the Davis-Bacon Act, signed by Hoover in 1931, and what this did was it mandated that prevailing union wages be paid by the federal government for public work projects, right? So it was using the state to they basically scooped up these unions and directly at the union wages. So that is interesting, and people have argued, funny enough, that it was something of a Jim Crow law because it in effect was prevented non-unionized blacks from competing.
Well, let's talk about that. And then, Mark, you've been very patient. If you want to talk about Ford a little bit, that would be helpful. But my research on Detroit in particular, which is one of the hardest hit cities in the country because of their kind of industrial nature and the decline in industrial good demand, and Ford in particular, where he shut his plant down completely in 1931, was that the ethnic composition of that city was very diverse. There was a lot of people from all over the world and Mexico even, and they actually ended up having discriminatory hiring practices at a certain point and favoring citizens versus non-citizens, and that actually ended up leading to 75% of Mexicans returning to Mexico. What did you have to say about Ford, Mark?
Just as to put more of a human face on what you guys are discussing about economics and how all these policies play out, is Ford himself was, in a good way, I think, a manic industrialist, as many other his peers around the same time were. And he loved production. He wanted to make as much money as he possibly could, but he was also a fair man. He wanted to take care of his employees. He paid them. He was against unions. He was, some would say, as things escalated, he was paranoid about unions. He had his sort of secret police, his own private police, not secret police, patrolling the big River Rouge factory. He had microphones set up in the bathrooms to make sure that there was no union organizing whatsoever going to happen. But he also paid his employees famously enough to afford his own cars. And as some have noted, this was actually not just because he's altruistic, but because he's taking a measure against unions and communists coming in and rabble-rousing that he's not being fair, that they're making products that they themselves cannot afford. And he wasn't making luxury items, and that was his revolution, that the Model T was not some luxury plaything for rich people like the previous automobiles, which had even been mass-produced before Ford had been, for like the Oldsmobile, for example, in the United States. It was something that working-class people could afford. But the things happened with the economy that you guys have been discussing at length, in detail, and he was not able to sell his cars anymore. He had several factories set up, but the main one was in the River Rouge one in Dearborn, Michigan. People were coming from all around the world and all around the country, and whereas in other places there was discrimination, especially later on as more jobs became scarce, particularly in the case of California and the Okies and other places that had jobs versus the places that didn't. There was migrations of people. Ford was welcoming, even towards blacks and, as you said, Mexicans, people from overseas, from Southern and Eastern Europe as well. And very suddenly, production had to stop because nobody could afford to buy his cars anymore. His cars were being bought on credit, the Model T, and all the way these markets play out, and he couldn't sell his cars anymore. Couldn't sell it to save his life, to keep this enormous factory running, where at one point I think one new car was pushed off the assembly line something like every 20 seconds or something like this. And so he had to shut his doors. And the narrative, and I admit I watched a PBS show about this, is that, oh, he's just unfairly he's just leaving his employees out in the cold. But as you guys would point out, who was in charge of how many immigrants came into the country beforehand? Well, that's not something you point out. That's something I thought of. Who was in charge of how these markets are going, how this credit is working? Ford had no desire to shut his doors, but he had to. And then there was this march on the factory, and I don't know what they expected him to do.
Yeah.
We know how these things usually play out. There was this enormous march of these thousands of laid off employees who had no jobs, who were in indeed dire straits. It wasn't like today. There was no welfare. They did indeed face starvation, but what was Ford supposed to do? Sell off all his machines or melt them down for scrap metal and then
No, I think they literally wanted him to keep making cars, but who's going to buy them? That's the problem.
Yes, precisely.
It's
and
like,
it's almost like, yes, Ford. So he hasn't lived beyond his means. He was working within his framework. And the whole culture, the zeitgeist, even including the president, the government, is produce as much as you can, make money, make products. It's wonderful. Industry is a wonderful new thing. Just push it as far as you can go. And agriculture was getting industrialized. Make as much as you can of this cash crop. No brakes on this train, sort of mentality. And then all of a sudden, they're in trouble. And I truly see it as the role of the government, the elites, whoever, but I don't include Ford in this because he wasn't a part of the government, though of course he had influence. He wanted it to fix it if he could, but he couldn't. Whoever is in charge to make it possible that either he could continue selling the cars, or at the very least that something like this doesn't happen again, which...
Well, he, in addition to our other... They were proposing, I forget if they actually ended up doing it is. It's like $25 million relief fund, right? Sort of a relief stimulus type thing, and this was opposed by the Red Cross, as seeing it as, being damaging to private charity. And also in opposition to this was Henry Ford and President Coolidge. Can't go wrong there. But we gotta always remember with Ford that he was on the right side of history, right?
Yes.
I mean, for instance, let me read a quote. It's rather surprising, is it not, that whichever way you turn to trace the harmful streams of influence that flow through society, you come upon a group of Jews.
Yes.
He later had to apologize for that, but that was only after
he
the media
completely. He said,
attacked him
sorry,
relentlessly.
forgive me, sorry. But historical documentary will be complete without stating, but the damage was done. And Hitler had his documents already and was translating them and reprinting them in Germany. Ominous music.
The international Jew. I mean, the problem was, of course, that he hadn't read Vox Day.
Yeah, he didn't know about, there's so much more, there's a lot more nuance. It's very complicated, and it is, in fact, the corrupt system that causes people to act the way they do.
Wait, what? Is Vox Day's
rhetoric, dialectic. I don't know.
Yes, you can't go answering.
Never apologize. SJWs always lie.
Oh, okay. I thought Vox Day was, somehow changing his tune on.
Well, he showed that as well.
You had me worried.
Just to back you up a little bit on Ford's sort of goodwill. I mean, again, like the stupidity of like them, like, oh, well, just give us jobs. And like, okay, well, if no one's buying my cars, I have no money after a certain point, except for my savings. Then I run out of money to pay you. So there's a problem there. So what he would do was like, look, okay, I don't want to like have you guys starving. So what we're going to do is we're going to reduce the hours each of you are going to work, because we don't need all of you to produce the cars at the rate we were going. But you can at least have a 4-hour-a-day job versus no one having an 8-hour-a-day job, or half of you having the 8-hour-a-day job. So he tried to increase the amount of people employed, even though they weren't working full-time. And so, again, he's trying, it's very rational what he's trying to do. And these critics of him, I think, are partially biased because of some of the things he said in these international, I won't say the word, but, these publications that were people accused him of being anti-Semitic for publishing.
Yes, it's he was very powerful, but he couldn't control the whole market and the way it was going. As you guys discussed, this is a very complex thing. But was there, correct me if I'm wrong here, there was no guidance from above, from president, executive, whatever, other people in his sphere of influence who could have influenced Ford that said, hey man, put the brakes on, don't quit making factories so fast, this might not be sustainable, you could get into trouble. Was there any major word of caution from anyone in power at that time saying this? No, it was pedal to the floor, and that's what he did. And then he is somehow to blame when he's he can't make money anymore.
And that includes all these people in the union. I mean, they all wanted the jobs. They all wanted the wealth. They're all just as greedy as the next person. The difference is they are stupid, and so they don't understand.
That's another thing. Trying to paint him as this awful elitist jerk, and he said something to the tune of very similar. Most men, or half of the men in this country, if they can get out of a day's work for the same pay, will. And I've been around the block a few times. I've had dozens of jobs. I'm 31 years old. I listen to that and I say, Henry Ford, you are completely 100% right. Men will take the money if they can get out of a day's work.
Yeah.
And you can't give the masses the benefit of the doubt, even at this time so long ago, 100 years ago, when there was no welfare state. As you said, the unions were gaining ground. Not just in industry, but as we will discuss later, in agriculture, demanding these much higher wages for completely unskilled labor.
Yeah, Henry Ford, I mean, I didn't actually realize there was this much controversy about him, firing or laying people off. But, look, I mean, he's a hero. He was proven right by expanding his factories by later history, because the automobile became an enormous success, and Ford increased production, well after the 30s, and made all sorts of different cars. And it's just you can't ask private business to engage in charity. Like, they don't know what they're doing. They're no good at charity. And that's just not the nature of...
He was engaging in charity by having employee housing, where he forbade alcohol, Hollywood movies, and jazz, and was encouraging square dancing. He was engaging in charity by paying his employees in cash, so they wouldn't take their check to a bar and drink up half of it, as was a very common thing at that time, because bars could cash checks back then. And the framing isn't the controversy just that he laid off these people. They're kind of looking at it both sides. From, like I said, this PBS thing I saw on other sources as well, I'm sure. But they're making it sympathetic that these thousands of workers who got laid off are marching on the factory, demanding that he open the gates and give them jobs again to make cars that no one's going to buy. Give me a break. Maybe if a much more, to contrast, something that makes much more sense is when the Red Cross had food in the South. And these farmers, these particular ones were white. Their kids haven't eaten for 3 days. It's kind of tied up in bureaucracy in the nearest town. The Red Cross's bags of wheat, etc. It goes like, well, we don't want to give it to farmers just for nothing. Blah blah blah. The local elites were kind of in charge of how to dole out the Red Cross relief food, and they got into a truck and just a big mob, and they weren't super intimidating, but they said, if you don't give us this food, we're going to take it. Our kids haven't eaten for 3 days. And they said, okay, each man gets a bag of flour and this and that. And that was good. You've got a clear objective, and it makes sense. The Red Cross is being stingy with giving out food. You go demand your food. There's objective solved. Right. But just marching toward the Ford factory saying, give us our jobs back. Take care of us.
Yeah, well, these are the same people. And, if I can disparage not quite my ancestors, but our ancestors, so to speak, recent forebears. People were honestly, these are people who were going to the bar and maybe cashing their check, as you said. People were not, the Flynn effect is a thing. People were dumb back then. A lot of the masses were kind of dumb back then.
We've got dumb masses now.
I've worked with auto workers, and they're still dumb. I mean, this is how they behave. They will buy the most blinged out car on credit, even though they work at a car factory from another car company. And it's like they live, I don't know how many miles away just to commute to this thing. And they're talking about, how they're buying this boat, and it's just, they're, and I don't disparage these people as a group, because like I don't want a society where it's just a bunch of like people like programming robots and everybody else is dead because they can't afford to buy food. I mean, it's just, I want jobs for people, okay, but they shouldn't be running the show is what I'm saying. They're not qualified to be running
should not
it,
be running the asylum,
and they shouldn't be told that they should be running it, and that's what the fucking communists do. That's the problem with communists.
Now it's China,
And I'm very much in favor of the elites. They have advantages, not just in power and wealth, but in intelligence. And I don't think they have a responsibility to make their lowest pleb as rich as them. No. But as we were discussing before the show, the plebs completely starving, as was the case during the Depression, because of the government saying you have to pay this much, and the company's saying screw that, we can't going to pay anybody because we can't afford to do that. Because then we'll be operating at a loss. That's on the government causing that problem.
The greatest American writer of this era, H.L. Mencken, the bourgeoisie.
Yeah.
Yeah, what you need is an elite. I mean, Henry Ford is sort of an ideal elite in that he's, like you said, he's handing out flour and he's getting guys not to drink and he's helping people,
Yeah, he was very paternal in his attitude toward his employees.
That's good. I mean, now what do we have? We have an elite who actively hate the great mass of the kind of non-lumpen proletariat, but like just the proletariat.
That's right.
They actively hate them.
They actively encourage exporting of these types of jobs to foreign countries, and they mock you if you do blue collar work. They insult their worth as a person, and to me, it's one of the highest forms of work because it's honest. It's honest work. Nobody can deny digging a trench is dishonest. It's like,
or they make up a fake story saying that quote unquote, this group is doing these jobs that this other group is unwilling to do, and that is bullshit.
Oh, it is. Yeah. I mean, if the prices were, reflecting, I mean, look, if you didn't have a massive influx of supply, wages would go up for this type of work. And so people could, and not be, this is complicated, but I think the reason Native American citizens don't do this very low-end work is because if they did, they'd be lumped in with these very poor people coming from even poorer circumstances.
They will not look twice at your application if you have an Anglo-sounding name, or if you go in for the place, if you're applying for landscaping, or say if you're a woman in housekeeping, changing out the rooms in a hotel. They will not look twice.
Yeah.
You are completely irrelevant.
If you want to work construction in anywhere from California to I don't know, much of the South, you got to speak Spanish if you want to do just labor, or you got to know people who have,
or unless you're like some sort of super upper crust, small segment of that labor force.
If you're skilled, then if you're skilled, that's not a problem. But if you're just gonna schlep, you got to speak Spanish basically. There's a bit of it.
I've worked in I don't know how many offices, but over 10 probably, and I've never seen a janitorial service that wasn't almost, if not 100%, almost 100% Hispanic, and they all spoke broken English, if any, and that to me means they were illegal. And so we've just got such a problem here that is right in front of people's faces, and there's this cognitive dissonance that's going on that people who cannot acknowledge it just drives me crazy.
And they would say that none of us, or say the most disadvantaged of our people, would be completely unwilling to do that work, to pick up a mop.
It's bullshit. It's bullshit.
Yeah, it is bullshit.
It's just
I've done landscaping. I've done construction. It was off the books.
I clean my apartment. I have my family. Was one of the few people in the neighborhood they live in that's never hired a gardener. It's just I will do the work, it's just, I don't want people knowing I do the work because it's the sort of a status thing. That's what it is to me. That's what it comes down to. Because you can't command a very high wage, and because you're associated with these immigrants, it's humiliating. Let's just be blunt. And so you have to strive for these like quote unquote high end jobs, and there's only a limited supply of those. And so it's just this hollowing out of the middle class that is the real issue.
And that's why the flows have to always be coming. This is the reason why we can never cut off immigration, and why they're so angry with Trump is because at both the low end and kind of the white collar end of the labor market, eventually obviously, like if you cut the supply off, obviously I favor completely, repatriating these people, returning them to their ancient homelands. But if you cut the supply off, eventually, wages will kind of move back up toward, if you will, like their theoretical equilibrium. It's because you're constantly disrupting the labor market that, like, the Indian guy who moves in and then buys a house and then goes to whatever stores and buys stuff doesn't create his own. He creates his own demand to support other peripheral industries. You have to constantly be disrupting that equilibrium and pushing the wages down. That's why.
I'm confused. Are you guys saying that wetbacks caused the Great Depression?
No. They increased the labor supply.
But things were so bad then that even it was a much smaller segment. They actually deported them, no hassle. But I think it's noteworthy that, as I was saying before, California, people living in the state of California were looking at people coming from the Midwest saying, screw you, you nasty invader. We can't take you. You're taking our jobs. That's hard to imagine these days. Like, say, North Dakota, people like moving up there for oil jobs, native people, residents of North Dakota being mad at them. It's kind of hard to imagine.
Well, the post-1965 immigration situation we have does make it, I mean, normally if we had a homogenous country, we would be talking about the kinds of things that led to the Great Depression and these sorts of problems would be the main issues. It wouldn't be, now we have these more obvious problems that we can't even get back to solving something like how are we going to do this fractional reserve banking if we're going to do this thing or whatever. And it just it's more, just more problems that you can't get to the other ones. I mean, this is a huge event in our nation's history, and this was happening in a homogenous country. I mean, you could have plenty of problems without immigrants. We don't need more.
Well, I think this is a good way to transition to the next episode where we talk about what people tried to do to solve this problem. And
well, I want to actually ask, before you close here, I want to ask Alex in particular about the Glass-Steagall. I mean, to give in summary, like, Hoover essentially instituted the first New Deal, and there were these, you had all these wage and price controls, these high tariffs on imports, particularly agricultural products. You had the Revenue Act of 1932, which was the single greatest tax increase during peacetime up to that date. You had, to bring it back around a little bit with the telephone and radio and stuff, you had this sort of all these new products were getting specific, all these luxury type, I guess you could say, luxury products were getting heavy taxes. You had the Norris-LaGuardia Act, in which it basically prohibited the federal courts to issue injunctions against labor disputes, ended yellow dog contracts, and basically gave a big boost to organized labor and its ability to act, basically engage in communist agitation. And the Glass-Steagall is the one I wanted to get into real quick, because you do hear it talked about quite a bit, do you not?
Yeah, people get all worked up about it's repealing and all that. I don't know. I just don't have like a strong opinion on it. I sort of feel like it just doesn't matter next to the monetary issues. Like, if you could just stabilize, I know it must be exhausting to hear me just keep harping on about it, but it just doesn't matter. Like, if you can stabilize the growth rate in the amount of money that's spent in the economy, or in this period, if you could stabilize the growth rate in just bank deposits, I just feel like the economy. You can have bank failures. Banks can fail if they want to. Investment banks want to get involved in all these commercial banking retail banking activities, then like big deal. Good luck, guys. If you fail, then that sucks. But we'll just we'll give your surviving competitors short-term loans to get through any sort of banking panic, and then you can go bankrupt, and it's not a big deal.
Well, yeah, the commercial and investment bank thing is the thing people usually focus on, and for the Great Depression, it is relevant to point out something that is probably less talked about regarding Glass-Steagall, which is that that's what allowed the Federal Reserve to use government bonds as collateral. They weren't able to do that previously. So it also increased the sort of the assets that were available for rediscount with the Fed.
I was not aware of that. Well, that is important because the Fed's hands were somewhat tied. I mean, if the Fed's buying, one of the easy ways for the Fed to increase the money supply in this period is to buy, or any period for that matter, is to buy U.S. U.S. Treasury debt, because it's sort of highly liquid, and it's sort of an obvious way that you're not really favoring any particular party in the private sector directly by doing that, and it also gets money out into the economy. So that's important.
Were they doing things like they are today, where they're buying up government debt in order to support deficit spending, or was the government able to borrow from the private sector? Because what have Bernanke's sort of not explicitly admitted.
They were just it's mostly just the rediscount rate for member banks. I mean, that was mainly what they were doing back then. So when the Glass-Steagall, that's when it allows them to use the bonds as collateral. I mean, that's when this started kicking off further, when they started upping the sort of scope of what the Fed.
They're allowing the member banks to use it as collateral. So then the banks are incentivized to buy government bonds. Is that kind of what you're saying?
No,
it was the Fed itself. Go ahead, Alex.
The Fed after 33, when they break the gold standard, or they revalue against gold, they have all this extra capacity now because they don't have to redeem. All they're doing is redeeming gold to foreign governments, I believe, foreign central banks. They're not redeeming gold to, average people. They have all this extra capacity to, increase Federal Reserve note issuance, so they could basically print out Federal Reserve notes and buy government debt either directly from a treasury or from the private sector. They weren't doing that beforehand. I mean, you wouldn't have had the massive collapse in the bank deposits if they'd been doing that. Because of course, once you give somebody, enough money that they're going to get rid of their Federal Reserve, they're going to get rid of their treasury debt. They'll give you their treasury bond for green paper. Then you can, then they're going to go do something with that money. Presumably, they're going to invest it in something, or even lend it out to somebody else. Or if it's the government directly, or directly financing the deficit, the government's going to go and spend those green pieces of paper that the Fed gave them, and then the public has those green pieces of paper, and then they'll put them in banks, and then banks will use that as the base for more bank deposit issuance.
All right, let's bring this to a close. This has been very enlightening, I think, though. So just to transition to our next episode, where we're going to be talking about when Franklin Delano Roosevelt takes office. In 1932, there was a very large protest of 17,000 World War I veterans that marched in Washington, D.C. It's kind of like a protest against President Hoover. And they were demanding payment of their promissory notes for their service in advance, and it was broken up. And so this was kind of
amongst them was none other than Smedley Butler.
There were a lot of very famous people. There was Douglas MacArthur, Patton, Eisenhower.
They were breaking it up. They were driving. MacArthur, Patton, and Eisenhower were breaking it up and telling them to GTFO.
Yeah.
As part of the security force.
And it was a year later that Franklin Delano Roosevelt was inaugurated, and he began his first 100 days of intensive legislative activity to fix this economic calamity. And so it's just an interesting contrast between kind of like the very paternal but kind of tough love policies of Hoover administration to some people's perspectives, at least these veterans, at least, versus the more humane, quote unquote, approach of Delano Roosevelt. Now that's sort of tongue-in-cheek somewhat, but I think that'll be a very interesting one to debate in our next episode. So any concluding remarks, you guys?
Yes, actually, regarding our next episode, remember, we cannot do everything at once, but we could do something at once. Calvin Coolidge.
Beautiful.